The murder of 17-year-old Josie Langmaid in 1875 devastated everyone in her hometown. It remains one of the most tragic stories of the 19th century. Let's get into the story. Josephine Anne Langmaid, commonly referred to as Josie, was born on November 7, 1857, to James Langmaid and Mary Ann Marden Langmaid in Merrimack County, New Hampshire. Her mother passed away in 1864, and her father later remarried Sarah Hazeltine. Josie had 6 siblings, 3 of whom were her half-siblings. Her uncle James William Marden was in the Civil War Union Army. He was enlisted in the 6th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers in 1861. Josie Langmaid was late for school the morning of October 4, 1775, because she had been waiting to walk with a friend who never showed up. 17-year-old Josie usually walked to school with her brother Waldo, who was a year younger. They both went to the Pembroke Academy, about 2.5 miles from the Langmaid home. Josie is described as pretty, intelligent, and well-liked by her peers, teachers, and neighbors. Typically, the siblings would link up with friends and other students also on their way to school. Lilia Fowler was a particularly close friend of Josie. The 2 girls were nearly the same age, and Lilia often waited for Josie so they could walk together. That morning, Josie was alone because she had left the farm late, and her brother had gone on ahead. Josie planned to meet up with Lilia Fowler, but Lilia waited as long as she dared, and not wanting to be late for school herself, she accepted a ride from a passing neighbor in a horse-drawn wagon. Josie did not arrive at school that day, and her brother, Waldo, assumed she had stayed home. When Waldo returned home after school and their parents learned that Josie had not made it to school, they reached out to their neighbors. Within half an hour, everyone in the nearby towns of Pembroke and Suncook was aware that Josie was missing. A search party of at least 100 men was formed to comb the woods between the Langmaid home and Pembroke Academy. As night fell, the search continued, with the men using torches to light their path. Around 9 that evening, the body of Josie Langmaid was found approximately half a mile from the school. In the flickering torchlight, the men could see that her clothes were torn and bloodied, and her body had been mutilated. Her head was missing. Later, during the post-mortem examination, it was revealed that she had been raped and that part of her had been cut away. The next morning, the search continued. About half a mile from the spot where the body was found, the search party found Josie's head, wrapped in her blue oilcloth cape. Her face had been cut, and there was a mark on her cheek where the killer had dug in his boot heel. On the road nearby, they found a broken, blood-stained, 3-foot-long wooden club. The citizens of Pembroke and Suncook were outraged that a crime so heinous was committed in their midst, and they were overwhelmingly frightened that the monster who committed it was still at large. A detective from Boston was brought in to help the local police, and towns throughout the East began rounding up tramps on suspicion. A man named John Meyer was arrested in Lowell, Massachusetts. He had blood on his shirt and scratches on his face, and he had come by train from Suncook the day Josie was murdered. Another tramp was arrested in Raymond, New Hampshire, and a third in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. Charles Moore, the only black man in Suncook, was arrested on suspicion, only because he was black. The first serious suspect the Pembroke police went after was a man named William Drew. The 24-year-old Drew lived with his wife in a shack in the woods, not far from the Langmaids. He had a reputation as a ne'er-do-well who allegedly made improper remarks to young women when he got them alone. Drew got word that the police were after him and left his home. He was arrested while walking on the road toward Concord, New Hampshire, and had to be protected from a lynch mob before being locked safely behind bars. The damning evidence against William Drew was provided by Miss Belle Lake, one of Josie Langmaid's teachers. She claimed that Josie told her that Drew had insulted her in the street, and when she threatened to tell her father, Drew responded, "Don't you tell him. If you do, I will murder you and cut you into inch pieces." William Drew was sent to the Concord jail for his safety. Soon after, Charles Moody, a friend of Drew's, was arrested as an accessory. Josie's brother, Waldo Langmaid, was affected by her murder and felt immense guilt for not being there to protect her. Since his sister's death, he had struggled with his health and emotional well-being. Tragically, he passed away just 2 months later at the age of 16, unable to cope with the loss of his beloved sister. On October 8th, the Suncook selectmen received a wire from the selectmen of St. Albans, Vermont. The wire explained that a year earlier, Marietta Ball, a young schoolteacher, had been raped and murdered in St. Albans under circumstances similar to the Langmaid murder. 20-year-old Marietta Ball had just been hired for a teaching position at a rural schoolhouse on French Hill during the summer months. She was described as a tall and slender young woman who was intelligent and kind-hearted. She had blue eyes, light brown hair, and weighed 130 pounds. Because she was a spinster, she didn't mind the work or her rural location. French Hill, being a steep and remote hill area located east of the city, involved a steep climb up the west slope before dropping behind a ridgeline to get to the schoolhouse. Even today, French Hill Road is steep and challenging, and in the winter it's a white-knuckle ride down to the safety of Route 104 below. Marietta had arranged for room and board with a neighbouring farm family, the Abels. After she would be finished at the schoolhouse, she would walk a lonely road that ran south from the schoolhouse, just underneath the crest of the hill, to get there. On the weekends, however, she would stay with the Page family, whose house stood at the very south end of the road, at the junction of today's Vermont Route 36. But on that warm July evening, she would never reach her destination. After much time had elapsed and Marietta hadn't arrived, the Pages began to worry. Towards the evening, Mrs. Page's concern got the best of her, and she began walking up the road to the nearby Collins residence to see if they had possibly seen her. As she walked up into the hills, the night air began to cool down, and the sunset was burning with fiery vengeance. The Collins, however, were just as surprised that Marietta hadn't shown up, and by 10 p.m., a search party was assembled. Not long after setting out, the party's lantern lights soon found what appeared to be the site of an ambush in a nearby hollow. Near the site of the ambush was their first clue hinting that something sinister had taken place here. A makeshift mask that had been made from a piece of torn carpeting. Around 1 a.m., Frank Harris, a black man who was employed by Mr. Page, began shouting that he had found a body. Through the haze of the lanterns, keeping the wild shadows at bay, the gruesome remains of Marietta Ball began to take form. Upon first assumption, the party agreed that she had been sexually assaulted, but a later post-mortem was conducted during daylight hours by a St. Albans physician named Dr. Fassett and a visiting New York physician, Dr. Janeway. Now they understood exactly what had happened. They noticed that her assailant had wrapped her head in her overskirt, which was a bit peculiar. Once that was removed, her brutal wounds were revealed. She had been savagely beaten to death. Her attacker must have had a moment of reconsideration and made a clumsy attempt at hiding what he had done. They noted that her limbs were also repositioned in an attempt to deceive whoever found her. They were certain that the killer was a man named Joseph Lepage. In Suncook, Joseph was known as a sort of wandering crazy person, yet he knew many persons there and frequently chased young girls, but did not have enough evidence to bring him to trial. Authorities in St. Albans had reason to believe that Joseph had moved to Suncook. Investigation determined that all of the original suspects, the tramps, the black man, and even William Drew and his friend, had alibis for the time of Josie's murder. Belle Lake's testimony against Drew had been a lie, possibly motivated by her animosity against him. Joseph was the only suspect that remained. After a week's worth of panicky arrests of random tramps and the town's only African-American, it soon became known that an itinerant French woodcutter named Joseph, who had been suspected of a similar slaying previously in St. Albans, Vermont, just so happened to be in the area. And upon arrest, he was found to have a boot whose bloodied heel appeared to match the shape of a violent gouge found on Langmaid's severed head. This is not reliable forensic evidence in the modern sense, but evidence began to exclude nearly every other person who had fallen under early suspicion, and the circumstances implicating Joseph soon stood out damningly. Perhaps the most powerful was a history of savage violence against women. Joseph, born outside Montreal as Joseph Paget, had come to live in the United States by escaping over the Canadian border after raping his sister-in-law, Julianne Roos. He had escaped the saint. Albin's prosecution in part thanks to alibis provided by his sons, who now recanted their testimony. Joseph was known to abuse his wife and was thought to have outraged his daughter. And it was found that in Pembroke, Joseph had been making unnervingly personal inquiries after the habits of his employer's pretty young daughter, a Pembroke Academy student herself, who customarily walked to school along Academy Road with Josie Langmaid. She might have been Joseph's intended target, but on the fateful morning she chanced to catch a carriage ride instead. Joseph lived in Suncook with his wife and 4 of their 5 children. He was originally from Quebec and spoke very little English. Joseph worked as a woodcutter for a man named Joe Daniels, who provided wood to power the steam engines in Pembroke's mills. On October 13th, members of an investigative team commissioned by the Attorney General of New Hampshire arrested Joseph at his home. In his house, they had found a blood-stained coat, and the heel of his boot matched a tracing made of the heel mark on Josie's face. The French community of Pembroke was livid, claiming that Joseph had been arrested only because he was French, just as Charles Moore had been arrested. After all, he was black. Joe Daniels, a leader in the French community, stated that Joseph had been with him at the woodlot the whole day of the murder, but Joseph had already told police that he had been lost in the woods that morning, unable to find his way to work. On October 28th, a grand jury indicted Joseph for the murder, rape, and mutilation of Josie Langmaid. The trial was largely one-sided in favor of the prosecution. In addition to the circumstantial evidence against Joseph, several witnesses came forward who had seen Joseph on Academy Road carrying a club or an axe the morning of the murder and the Saturday prior. Joseph's sister-in-law, a woman named Julianne Roos, came from Canada to testify. She told the court that 5 years earlier, Joseph had threatened her with a club and raped her in a cow pasture. He had been wearing a homemade mask. She pulled off the mask and recognized him. The mask was significant because a similar mask had been found near the spot where Marietta Ball was killed. Joseph was found guilty of both murders. His attorney appealed the verdict because the testimony of Julianne Roos was not relevant to the crime for which Joseph was being tried. The New Hampshire Supreme Court agreed, and the verdict was thrown out. Joseph was tried a second time and again found guilty of murder in the first degree. March 14th, 1878, the day before his execution, Joseph made his last confession to 2 Catholic priests of Concord's French community. Before they left, the priest convinced Joseph to confess his crimes to the secular authorities. He admitted to raping and killing both Josie Langmaid and Marietta Ball, and on a map he traced the route he took to the site of Josie Langmaid's murder. He had not followed Academy Road, but taken a shortcut across lots. Those who had testified to seeing him there had either been mistaken or were deliberately lying. Joseph then pointed to a map where he had hidden some of Josie's possessions. They were found where Joseph indicated, proving that Joseph was her killer. He was hanged in Concord on March 15, 1878.